Hi everyone. For some reason I decided to fiddle around in the editing software and see what it would sound like if I put RahXephon sound bits over Glue 70 by Kasten. And anyways, this would require B-roll from RahXephon, but I didn't feel like having to record or rewatch 6 hours of a show I'm not the most fond of if you've seen my retrospective on it. So I simply watched RahXephon Pluralitas Contentio, the RahXephon movie. Now, I only briefly mentioned this in my 5.5 hour retrospective on the original, where all I said was that I wouldn't look at the movie in that video because of my policy of watching stuff in a vacuum. However, I had never really seen it before this. I mean, I think I watched it at double speed for the original retrospective, but I never actually took the time to watch it properly, and it was so different than what I was expecting, well, that I had to make a video on it. Now, this is simply often portrayed or told of or spoken of as a simple clip show movie, the kind of thing assembled from ready-made scenes stitched together with a few lines here and there to construct a somewhat neat summary of the original plot in order to appeal to fans, sell more tickets, and just kind of get the general lore out there. What we get here with PC is, well, it's very different from the source material. Where the clip show I was thinking of was the typical fare where it's only about 10% new stuff simply meant to even out transitions between recycled scenes. What we get here with Pluralitas Contentio is honestly a majority of new stuff or stuff that's been heavily edited. And you can see that here with a lot of new additions and tweaking. The plot itself is greatly tweaked, and actual mechanics and motivations are actually explained here, and there's even a rather different ending, although you can technically argue it isn't mutually exclusive with the ending of the original series. In fact, I would go as far as to say that at least 50% of the visuals and 65% of the dialogue are new, and the movie feels almost completely different from the original in my eyes. But, led me to asking, is it better? And more importantly, is it worth a watch whether or not it is better? Well, in an attempt to stick to the vacuum rule, I will state whether or not I think it's worth a watch in a vacuum, and then if I think it's better than the original or not. To do this though, let's first establish the plot and how it differs from the original. On a fundamental level, the plot is kind of the same as the original RahXephon. Ayato Kamina is a being of mixed Mulian and human blood, and the two groups attempt to sway him to their cause of retuning, essentially reshaping, the world to their vision. Now they both want to retune the world, however their views and visions of what the world should be are very different, so their goals are actually mutually exclusive, even if they both say they want to retune the world, because they have different ideas of how it should be tuned. Something else to note is that the Mu are very advanced interdimensional beings or aliens or something, they're not really specified, who realize Ayato's potential as a, quote, instrumentalist in order to retune the world to their vision. For this reason, they try to keep him to themselves by forming the Tokyo Jupiter, a giant impenetrable wall around Tokyo where Ayato lives. This happens when Ayato is 17, and while he's dating Mishima, who is also 17, but out of town at the time. I note this because Mishima Haruka later becomes Shito Haruka, and that Tokyo Jupiter's time dilation effect causes the two to age differently. This means that while Ayato essentially remains 17, Haruka ages normally in the outside world and is 29 at the beginning of the series. I note this because this causes a lot of issues with the relationship setups later in the series, and because it's important context for understanding why the relationship just doesn't work. Anyways, Ayato is kidnapped by Terra agent Haruka Shito, Mishima, who convinces him to work for the humans and fight the Mu. His convictions to do so are only solidified when he's kidnapped back by the Mu and has an identity crisis. He then decides he will protect Haruka, whom he was separated from by the arrival of the Mu when they were dating as teenagers, and thus he retunes the world in favor of humanity. Now these are only very, very broad strokes here, but on this zoomed out level, the plots of this and the original are essentially the same. However, once we zoom in to any degree, we start to see a lot of differences. For one, the movie makes a lot of small logistical tweaks to streamline everything and generally make more sense. For example, in the original series, Quan awakens and then she and Ayato are willing to return to Tokyo Jupiter to, quote, find themselves, and they kind of stumble around for a bit. There's an action scene here or there, and there's a lot of that. However, When it comes for Ayato to return to Tokyo Jupiter in this movie, Kwan sleeps through the whole thing and Ayato is just kidnapped by his mother. Very simple, very straightforward solution here. In addition to these small logistical changes, there are very many large changes to plot structure, plot events, and what characters do what, in addition to even what characters show up. I'm not going to go over all of these changes. The point of this video is not to compare and contrast the timeline of both RahXephons. It's just to say that I am aware that this is an extremely different timeline with different people doing different things, but I don't really feel I need to go into it other than mentioning that I'm aware of that fact. In addition, in this version of the story, Ayato remembers Haruka from the very start, and he's insistent upon meeting her again from the very start of the movie, instead of having some complete amnesia that makes her seem even creepier than she is. This single change helps the movie a ton, and we'll get there when we get there, although I should note that it doesn't completely save the movie, or their relationship dynamics as a whole, note you, but the bar was pretty low to start with. In addition, the ending is completely different in this version of RahXephon, where instead of the world resetting and Ayato and Haruka getting married and being shown as a young couple, as if nothing ever separated them or happened, Haruka instead is shown in this future, reflecting upon her past with Ayato. And I like this a lot more, and this will get its own segment later on. Do I think the movie passes the vacuum test, though? I have to say, not quite. Now look, I know there are a lot of fans of RahXephon out there, and I've seen comments by them, and I don't mean to insult you or your taste in productions. RahXephon is very interesting from a production standpoint to me. However, I will say that as I found the original series very flawed, this production itself is also very flawed, but in very different ways at times. It's an extremely odd piece to judge in the context of the vacuum test, as it is both essentially some kind of abridged retelling of a story already told, and yet it very obviously wants to go in different directions from the original. Ignoring this though, if this was a standalone feature, I would still say that I think it's too flawed to stand on its own. The fact of the matter is that while the movie does go out of its way to fix some of RahXephon's greatest sins, like unclear motivations, vague mechanics, and the horrible romance elements of the original series, attempting to patch these up takes so much time here that there isn't a lot of actual physical substance here, stuff other than exposition and dialogue scenes. I'm talking about action scenes, funny character moments, and the smaller minutiae that make movies feel lived in. And I know I say that none of these should be the core of any series. A series doesn't need to be action-packed to be great. However, you cannot be simply 100% dialogue and exposition scenes, and it kind of feels like this movie leans into that at times. And this, along with the obvious rough editing and the very choppy, rushed flow of the movie, are things that you would regardless whether or not you had seen the original. The structure itself here is just so fast-paced and choppy at times that I don't think I could consider it the greatest. I think it is coherent, and it's obvious that they tried their best here, but if you've never seen RahXephon, the original series, you'd still be able to identify the flow issues here. I wouldn't consider the flow here as anything better than attempted avant-garde or attempted brevity, and it doesn't really get a pass at either of these. You could argue it does, but I don't know. I think that whether or not you'd seen the original here, the structural anomalies are objective issues when watching this video, and you would notice them in a vacuum or not. Therefore, I don't think the movie is capable of standing on its own simply for objective issues pertaining to its pacing, and the fact that we don't really get to know any of the characters as well as we would hope to in any kind of movie, especially a quote-unquote romance movie. The movie simultaneously feels too short because there's not a lot of action or stuff happening here other than exposition, combined with rough quick cuts, and yet too long as there's still a ton of stuff that they could explain and explore that we just don't really get, in addition to all of the new stuff here added to try and patch over the issues of the original series. It doesn't quite feel coherent, and while I think I would be able to follow it had I not seen the original, I'm not 100% sure of that because I don't 100% understand the original either. I think this piece was kind of screwed from the start if I'm being honest, as if it leaned more into the source material, that would mean leaning into the fundamental structural issues of the source material more. But if it went even further out of the way of the original source material, Well, at that point, why not just make a new franchise? I mean, I would argue that the movie is mostly, at least 55%, completely new stuff, and it definitely feels much different from its predecessor. And yet, like its predecessor, it's marred by constant foundational and structural issues and questionable decisions, even if they manifest slightly different here. Which gets us to comparing the two. Starting off, the actual production technicals, visuals, sounds, etc. are just as good as the original and still great. It's obvious that there's a lot of technical competence still here, so I'm not really going to spend any more time on that other than saying that in both this and the original, the technicals are probably the strongest aspect of RahXephon, as the OST especially is something very good and worth a listen. They did also get some new voice actors for a few characters in this telling of RahXephon, but those characters have such little screen time in this version of it that it's not really a noticeable issue. One of the things that they added to this version that I did like, though, is a kind of motif of referencing Alice in Wonderland, which does a decent job establishing the dreamlike nature of what's happening here and opens up a conversation about the importance of memories, something that they do to try and make Haruka's obsession with Ayato seem more justifiable or relatable, but again, we'll get there when we get to the relationship segments of this video. Pluralitas Contentio, in spite of its shorter length, generally does a much better job explaining the basics of this world and why its factions do what they do. There's less vague subterfuge and more of just a character looking directly into the camera and saying, Quan is a failed tuner and you must fight her to clear the way. Or, hey Ayato, we have to retune the world because if we don't, the universe will collapse. Or, hey, while both sides want to retune the world, what they want is actually mutually exclusive because their views on how it should be done are extremely different. Now, while you could argue that the delivery of a lot of these exposition points is very clunky and comes at the expense of, actual stuff actually happening on screen, these are all points that I wish someone just explained in the original. In fact, it feels like someone watched the original and wrote down all the common sense questions they would have from it, and then whoever made this movie went out of their way to have a character address those specific questions. And I do like that, but I think it's kind of a damning statement that this condensed 2-hour version of the show somehow feels like it explains more and makes more logistical sense than the original 6-hour series. And this also extends in the character motivations, which are generally more fleshed out here too. Where the motivations of all sides in the original was retune the world, and it really made no sense why Ayato suddenly wanted to do this, or why Maya was pregnant tragically, or what Lord Bobbin's goal here at all was, in PC, in this version of RahXephon, everything here makes much more sense. Instead of simply saying Maya is mad because her son chose the other side, thus making her fail in her objective, they add a mechanic here where awakening one's Mu blood erases prior human memories. This means that Ayato is the only manifestation of Maya's dead husband's love, and thus all that she has to remember him by, because she doesn't remember him because she loved him when she was a human. And this means that he's a tangible link to her past, and it makes it a lot more obvious as to why she would care for him, and it actually does feel like she kind of cares for him in this version of the show. It adds an emotional impact to her surrendering her son to Haruka, and her guilt on making him pilot the RahXephon also makes a lot more sense because this is something that she was supposed to do but couldn't because of her pregnancy with him. All of this enhances Maya's character, and while I don't like her, I think that her motivations make a lot more sense in this version of the story, and I can see people relating to her to some extent now instead of just kind of ignoring her or being actively annoyed whenever she talks. In addition, this new mechanic of awakening Mu blood destroying your human memories adds a kind of ticking clock element that fully explains Ayato's sudden decision to retune the world. He wants to do it while he's still a human, so he has his human memories so that he can protect those he remembers, like Haruka, instead of just choosing the barbaric Mu by the default option of his blood. This contrast between human and Mu methods also makes it clear why he chooses the human side and gives at least a little value to Haruka's obsession with him, as this did kind of influence his decision. In addition, where Lord Bobbin feels like some kind of wheeling and dealing idiot who essentially plays both sides, arguably successfully in the original, here, he's a much more obviously bad guy, attempting to manipulate the humans into executing his Mu goal. And I like the fact that all of these character motivations and little details make a lot more sense from a logistical view in this version of the story. Getting to the ending, I also prefer the ending here to the one in the original. Instead of some weird flashback and then psychological discussion and then some kind of like weird reset, we get the same visuals here, but with a much more coherent and sensible series of dialogues, wherein awakened Ayato explains to Haruko that A, he's happy she showed him the importance of love. B, that he has to go and become the overseer of time now, so she can't stay with this version of him. But C, she will be able to return to the real world and live a nice life with the quote, memories of Ayato. Now, this isn't explained completely, but what I think this means is that ascended Ayato separates from the human form he once had, and that she can now live with that human form who will be her age, because I guess, like, since the world is retuned, they never actually got separated, or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if this means she's literally married to his human stand-in or equivalent or something like that, or if she's living in, like, an actual dream dimension, but I lean towards a literal interpretation, seeing as that she does get married to him and seem to live a life with him for quite a while. Now, I do mention live in the past tense because we see by the ending that he has died. And while it does seem like an odd decision, it makes sense in my head. I have criticized RahXephon for being extremely escapist, and I think this new ending where Ayato has already passed on is a kind of response to this. Yes, Haruka got to marry the man she was obsessed with, but that has already ended by the point we see her. But she's okay with this, and it seems that she's learned to stand on her own to some extent, I think. And there is a silver lining where even though she's kind of learned to live without human Ayato, Time Overseer Ayato does come visit her every now and again, even in her old age. I know it seems like a weird ending, and the decision to make Ayato dead is even more bizarre, but I stand by it compared to the original ending. However, that gets us to their relationship. For one, Ayato's amnesia is less prominent in this version, so he states reuniting with Mishima as one of his core objectives from the very start. This means Haruka seems less creepy, and everything feels about 14% more natural. Haruka still worries about him, but she's the one who initially rebuffs him, as she thinks it's better that she simply move forward, and overall she seems more stable and aware of the importance of not stagnating here. Now, she does go back on these things, but at least they tried to set some kind of precedence where Haruka's kind of moving on with her life and kind of aware of the weird optics here. The relationship is still fundamentally flawed in my view, though, and it still sinks the movie near the end, but we'll get there when we get there in the cons section. Finally, a lot of the positives of the movie consist of what's not here. Pluralitas Contentio is pretty ruthless when it comes to cutting content, and for the most part, that's a positive. The original RahXephon is bloated to an almost unimaginable extent, and there's no pointless relationships or relationship drama here, there's much fewer characters overall, and a ton of fluff is simply cut. While I don't consider this a tight production, they were not afraid to get rid of a lot here, and I think it does benefit the movie overall. And this does in turn even benefit some of the main characters, as Ayato and Haruka are somewhat more developed, I guess, and even Rikto feels more prominent and tragic here. However, while noted as improvements, that doesn't mean that the movie is good. In fact, I say it's still far from perfect, and now it's time we look at some of its critical issues. As noted earlier, so much time is spent trying to patch up the exposition gaps of the original that it comes at the expense of what is actually happening on screen and clean scene transitions. I feel like this movie is kind of a sprint between as many important conversations as possible, with a few action snippets spliced in for flavor. I have said that a movie or anime does not need to be action-packed to be good, but I think it's fair to say that a sci-fi action movie should have, well, more of those two elements than what's presented here. So much time is shifted to explaining stuff and attempting to just make the romance passable that the actual sci-fi and action elements of the original are kind of buried here. This almost feels like a synopsis or documentary, which is really weird considering how much it differs from the original. It's so different from the original that it doesn't really serve as a synopsis of it, so instead this feels like a clip show of something that doesn't exist. Yeah, I know the original anime does, but there's so many differences here between the two that you could practically consider them different shows. And this incoherence is only enhanced by the lack of connective tissue, as the drive to explain everything makes the big picture make more sense, but it moves everything else along so fast that it's often disoriented, even if things are explained point blank to the audience. The presentation is simply too rushed and dense here to be done cleanly in the amount of time allotted, and you can definitely feel that. If the original RahXephon did feel plotting and bloated at times, this feels like a breakneck pace which cuts everything to the bone in order to try and get its point and mechanics across. These are both fundamentally flawed methods, they're just flawed in opposite ways. In addition, while some of the cuts were necessary or positive, a lot of the stuff that was cut, while not being super necessary, did help flesh out the original. Note the near complete lack of Elve, Kim, Makoto, Megami, and Yagamo in this version of RahXephon, all characters who made net positive contributions to the original and whose presence was kind of missed here. In fact, all we really get in terms of characters are Ayato and Haruka, with a few extra lines from Professor Ricto, Kunigi, and Maya, and Lord Bobbin. Yes, even Anime Columbo did not make the cut, and as unnecessary as he felt to the original, his presence will be greatly missed here. While I have praised a lot of the cuts made by this version of RahXephon, I do think it's important that the overall shorter length can be seen as detrimental. On a positive side, if you don't like either version, this wastes less of your time. But from a less cynical standpoint, it is important to note that one of the only reasons I actually kind of like or am able to watch the original series is because it is such a weird thing to watch. It's 24 or 26 episodes of meandering and questionable writing backed by vague storytelling, bizarre edits, and an overall cracked foundation. It's very bizarre and I don't think it's objectively good, but it is something that I can watch for its sheer production weirdness alone. And that makes it fascinating in its own bizarre, flawed way. However, since this is a condensed version of that's under 2 hours, it means that a lot of the production weirdness simply doesn't have time to come out and really make itself shine. For example, there are filler episodes in RahXephon, the original series, where you're like, what is happening here? Why does this episode exist? Is this subplot going to come back? Probably not. Why did they do the things they do? And you really kind of dwell on the production aspects of it, and that does add a little interesting layer to the RahXephon experience. At least for me, it was the most interesting layer, if I'm being honest. However, with only 2 hours to work here, you don't really get that layer because you're simply going from conversation to conversation to conversation, the action scene to conversation to conversation to conversation, without any real time to bask in any possible production weirdness. Now, the production is flawed in that its pacing is not the best, and they make some very weird, questionable writing decisions, but there's no time to bask in any of the small, weirder minutia of why is Itsuki telling this person that? What is that character doing? Why are we having an episode focused on this? There is no bizarre filler to really enhance bizarre production decisions. So this version of RahXephon feels less charming simply because there's less time to enjoy the so bad it's good aspects of RahXephon. And I do note that because I'm grading on enjoyability and not objective expertise here, because objectively I don't think I would really recommend either of these. But from an enjoyability level, I think I could maybe recommend the original 6-hour version of RahXephon. 26 episodes of something that you might not like, but you will remember, and it will make you perhaps chuckle here and there. This, on the other hand, doesn't have that because it simply lacks the filler to elicit such strong emotional responses of confusion or production pondering. However, even if this version of RahXephon goes through all of this effort to try and patch everything up, it's not even completely effective at points, as since this is a RahXephon story, the key foundational issues are still present, especially that of the relationship between Ayato and Haruka. I do appreciate that they actually took their time to add about 25 minutes of Ayato and Haruka pre-separation, so we can see that they actually cared for one another quite a bit, and this does add some foundation to their relationship. And I also like that Haruka is the one that tries to maintain distance at first, aware of the creepy dynamics here, but all of this is window dressing over the same foundational issues of the scenario as a whole. And those foundational issues consist of A, two people lingering on a past relationship for way too long, for Haruka over 9 years, B, their failure to move on and establish healthy relationships with others, not just romantically but in general, and C, Haruka straight up committing a felony. Yeah, this is probably the most uncomfortable moment in the whole movie, and the thing that convinced me that no, this is not going to save RahXephon. In the original, Ayato was 17. However, here, they still maintain Ayato as 17, and then decided to have an implied coital scene. And, you know, it is implied, they don't show anything, but it's very obvious what happened, and that makes me ask, just why? Haruka just decides to become a felon, and it's disgusting to me. and really drives home the point that while the relationship here is presented in a better light, it is still not one to be idolized and praised. It still has the issues of people fixating on something they should have moved on from by now, and it still fixates on a relationship that is illegal. And I feel like the production is still trying to gaslight me into believing there's no questionable aspects of their relationship here, even though there are very many questionable aspects of their relationship here. The point of the matter is that establishing a relationship between a 17-year-old boy and a 29-year-old woman is so weird and fundamentally flawed that no matter how you try to adapt it or quote unquote improve it, it's still going to be a deal breaker for me. And where that didn't work in the original series, it still doesn't work here, especially if you decide to make a scene that pushes it across the line of creepy to immoral and illegal. So yes, I feel very strongly about this, and I feel like that it's such a critical issue that it does definitely sink the movie for me. All in all, while I did have high hopes for this production when I first noticed it'd be rather different from its source material, I'm still left with the same sense of gnawing confusion and disappointment that I got from the original. It did feel refreshing at first, however RahXephon is so fundamentally flawed in its premise and execution that this feels like a band-aid whose effectiveness is determined solely by the amount of cope you're willing to engage in. Meaning that the movie is hamstrung by the fact that it is simply a RahXephon movie. It's based on something so structurally and foundationally flawed that it cannot excel. In addition, this basis leaves the movie in this weird gray zone where, since it's at least nominally composed of a different thing, the original anime, it's hard to distinguish its own self-contained identity. And yet its many differences often don't go far enough to patch up the core issues of the source material and come at the expense of a lot of the cool sci-fi action and charm of the original. Yes, a lot of cuts and edits do make this a more coherent version of RahXephon. But if they come at the expense of the original core charm of the series, how much of a net positive is that? On my video on the original RahXephon, I compared it to a beef Wellington that a chef spent all day preparing, only to bake for 5 minutes and serve it raw. Well, if the original is a beef Wellington that's only been cooked 5 minutes, this is a beef Wellington that was cooked, but the chef focused on it so much that he forgot that he doesn't own forks, chairs, or a table to set it on. Yes, it seems better, but there is still a lot of issues surrounding it, and there's a palpable lack of any action or setting craft, and a lot of the other charms that the other version uses as a crutch at times. While in a different way, this is still kind of an incoherent mess, with questionable relationships and weird, sometimes uncomfortable writing. It's still a production that feels rushed and yet also bloated. It's still RahXephon.